No one expected what this man would do when he found a gray wolf crying in pain, trapped and helpless. The wild is ruthless, and predators are feared. But what happened after the rescue was beyond imagination. Get ready for a gripping story of trust, survival, and an emotional bond that defied nature itself. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories like this one. The sun was setting over the vast, snow-covered wilderness. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and frost. Ethan Carter, a rugged outdoorsman in his early 40s, trudged through the woods with a hunting rifle slung over his back. Not for sport, but for protection. Living alone in the wilderness had taught him to respect nature, but it had also made him wary. Then he heard it. A low, agonized cry echoed through the trees. Ethan froze. It wasn't the sound of a wounded deer or a distant coyote. This was different, raw, desperate, and filled with suffering. His instincts kicked in. He followed the sound, moving carefully through the thick snow. The cries grew louder, more heartbreaking with each step. Then, through the dense brush, he saw it. A massive gray wolf, its thick fur covered in snow and dirt, lay on the ground, writhing in pain. Its front leg was caught in a steel trap, the metal teeth clamped tightly around its flesh. Blood stained the snow beneath it. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The wolf was crying, not growling, not snarling, crying. It wasn't the sound of aggression. It was the sound of pain and exhaustion, a defeated creature who had fought until it could fight no more. Their eyes met. For a split second, Ethan expected the wolf to lash out, to show its teeth in a final act of defiance, but it didn't. It just lay there, watching him, its golden eyes filled with something Ethan had never seen before in a predator. Plea. It was asking for help. Ethan swallowed hard. Every instinct told him to turn away. This was nature's way, and interfering could be dangerous. But something deep inside him wouldn't let him walk away. He slowly reached for his knife. The wolf didn't flinch. Ethan crouched down, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. His fingers hovered over the handle of his hunting knife, but his mind raced with uncertainty. Saving a trapped wolf was madness. A wild animal in pain was unpredictable. The moment Ethan loosened the steel trap, the wolf could attack, driven by instinct and fear. One wrong move, and those powerful jaws could tear through his arm. And yet, the wolf did not growl. It didn't even flinch when Ethan moved closer. It just lay there, panting heavily, the exhaustion in its golden eyes telling a story of pain, struggle, and surrender. Ethan scanned the area. The trap was rusted and cruel, likely placed by poachers. He had seen traps like this before, illegal and brutal. He clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a matter of letting nature take its course. Someone had left this wolf to die slowly. The animal whimpered again, its ears flicking weakly as it tried to move its wounded leg. Ethan exhaled. He couldn't leave it like this. He moved carefully, his boots crunching the snow as he approached. Every muscle in his body was tense. "Easy, buddy," he muttered, his voice low and calm, even though his heart was pounding. The wolf blinked at him but did not move. Slowly, Ethan knelt beside the trap. The stench of blood and metal filled his nose. The wolf's front leg was caught between the steel jaws, the fur around the wound dark with dried blood. It was bad, but not beyond saving. Ethan reached into his backpack and pulled out a thick wool blanket. He had to immobilize the wolf before attempting to free it. "All right," he whispered. "Don't make me regret this." With steady hands, he gently draped the blanket over the wolf's head, covering its eyes. If the animal panicked, this would keep it from seeing his movements, reducing the chance of a deadly reaction. The wolf let out a soft huff, but didn't resist. Ethan's fingers tightened around his knife, and with a deep breath, he pried at the rusted mechanism of the trap. The metal groaned in protest. The wolf let out a pained grunt, tensing beneath the blanket. But it did not snap at him. Ethan's pulse raced. He twisted the knife deeper, using it as leverage. The trap had been left in the cold for too long. Its hinges were frozen. He needed more force. Digging his boots into the snow, he gritted his teeth and heaved with all his strength. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, snap! The jaws of the trap released. The wolf jerked back instinctively, letting out a strangled yelp as its leg was freed. It scrambled backward, shivering violently. Ethan jumped away too, his knife still clutched in his hand. His instincts screamed at him to be ready. This was the moment the wolf would strike. But the attack never came. Instead, the wolf collapsed onto the snow, its chest heaving, its injured leg trembling too much to hold its weight. It wasn't thinking about revenge. It was just relieved. Ethan kept his distance, watching the wolf carefully. He knew it was still in survival mode. One sudden movement could change everything. The animal lifted its head slightly, ears still hidden under the blanket. Its body was weak, trembling with exhaustion and pain. Ethan hesitated before reaching into his pack again. He pulled out a strip of dried venison, left over from his last meal. He tossed it gently in front of the wolf. The animal's nose twitched. It hesitated, then slowly sniffed at the offering. A long moment passed. Then, to Ethan's surprise, the wolf took the food. Ethan felt something stir deep inside him. A silent moment of trust had just been exchanged. He exhaled, lowering his knife. The wolf had chosen to accept his help, and that changed everything. But this wasn't over yet. The wolf was too weak to move, and the temperature was dropping fast. If Ethan left it here, the cold would finish what the trap had started. He had a choice to make: walk away and let nature take its course, or do something even more insane. Ethan already knew the answer.
Ethan crouched in the snow, staring at the wolf. The hardest part was done. The trap was open, and the wolf was free. But the animal was too weak to move, its injured leg trembling, barely able to hold its weight. The reality of the situation hit him. If he left now, the wolf would die. The wound, combined with the freezing temperatures, would be enough to finish what the poacher's trap had started. Ethan sighed, rubbing his gloved hands together as his breath curled into the cold air. Saving it was one thing, but bringing it back with him, that was a whole new level of crazy. His cabin was miles away. The wolf was too big to carry easily, and there was no telling what might happen once the animal regained some strength. It could attack. It could flee. Or worse, it could die in his arms. Despite everything he had done, he looked at the wolf again. The animal wasn't watching him with fear anymore. No, there was something else in those golden eyes. Something almost trusting. That was enough. He wasn't walking away. Ethan stood up, adjusting the straps of his backpack. "All right, buddy," he muttered. "Looks like you're coming with me." The wolf flicked an ear, but it made no effort to move. Ethan unzipped his pack, pulling out another strip of dried venison. He tossed it into the snow between them. The wolf sniffed at it cautiously before lowering its head and taking the food. A good sign. Ethan then reached for the blanket he had used before, shaking off the snow. Slowly, carefully, he stepped toward the wolf and knelt down beside it. It didn't flinch. The blanket wasn't just for warmth. It was a shield, a barrier between them. If the wolf suddenly lashed out, Ethan needed something between his arms and those razor-sharp teeth. Gritting his teeth, he carefully wrapped the blanket around the wolf, securing it like a sling. The animal tensed, but didn't fight him. "Easy," Ethan murmured as he slid his arms underneath its body. The moment his hands touched the wolf's side, he felt its ribs. Too thin. This wolf had been starving even before it got caught in the trap. It wouldn't have survived much longer, even without the injury. Taking a deep breath, Ethan lifted. The weight was more than he expected. The wolf was lean but muscular, its body limp with exhaustion. Even through the blanket, Ethan could feel its heartbeat, fast and unsteady. The wolf let out a weak whimper, its head resting against Ethan's arm. Yeah, Ethan muttered, adjusting the animal's weight. "You and me both, buddy." The wolf didn't fight him. It wasn't resisting. That was the moment Ethan knew. This wolf had accepted his help. Ethan adjusted his grip and began the trek back to his cabin. The snowfall had thickened, coating the landscape in fresh white powder. His boots crunched heavily with every step, his breath forming thick clouds in the freezing air. Carrying the wolf wasn't easy. The weight slowed him down, and the cold was relentless, biting through his clothes. Every few minutes, he glanced down at the wolf, still breathing, still conscious. That was all that mattered. Time passed in a blur. Ethan's arms ached from the effort, his legs burning from the weight. The wind howled through the trees, but he kept moving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw it. His cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, a beacon of warmth in the frozen wilderness. Relief surged through him. Almost there, he muttered to the wolf, though he doubted the animal understood. The wolf let out a faint exhale, its head pressing slightly against Ethan's chest. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was trust. Ethan kicked open the cabin door, stepping inside. Heat immediately wrapped around him, the wood stove crackling in the corner. He gently lowered the wolf onto a pile of blankets near the fire. The animal let out a weak sigh, its body stretching slightly as if finally allowing itself to rest. Ethan quickly moved, grabbing his first aid kit. He had treated injured animals before. Never a wolf, but a wound was a wound. Carefully, he unwrapped the blanket. The wolf didn't move. Ethan examined the wound. The leg was swollen, the fur matted with dried blood. It needed to be cleaned, and that wasn't going to be pleasant. "I know you're not going to like this," Ethan murmured. "But if I don't fix this, you're going to have a much bigger problem." The wolf didn't react. It was too weak to fight him now. Ethan grabbed a clean cloth, soaked it in warm water, and pressed it to the wound. The wolf flinched, but it didn't bite. That was enough. Ethan worked quickly, cleaning the wound, wrapping the leg in fresh bandages, and making sure the bleeding had stopped. When he finished, he leaned back with a heavy sigh. The wolf was watching him, not with aggression, not with fear, but with something Ethan couldn't quite describe. Maybe understanding? Ethan chuckled. Yeah, don't get any ideas. You're not staying here forever." The wolf blinked slowly. Ethan wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or agreement. Either way, one thing was certain. Their story wasn't over yet. The storm had settled by morning, leaving a thick layer of fresh snow blanketing the forest. Inside Ethan's cabin, the warmth of the crackling fire contrasted with the icy world outside. The gray wolf lay motionless near the hearth, its breathing slow and steady. The bandage around its wounded leg was still secure, and the swelling had begun to subside. It was alive. But for how much longer, Ethan couldn't say. He poured himself a cup of coffee, leaning against the wooden counter as he watched the animal carefully. "This is a bad idea," he muttered under his breath. Taking in an injured predator was one thing, but if the wolf made a full recovery, it would regain its strength. Would it still trust him then? Or would it revert to its wild instincts? Ethan sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. "This is crazy," he muttered. Then, a soft sound broke the silence. Ethan froze. The wolf had shifted slightly, its ears twitching. A faint, weak whimper escaped its throat as it tried to move. It was waking up. Ethan grabbed a small chunk of dried venison from his supply and carefully approached. The wolf's body was still tense, its injured leg barely moving. "Easy," Ethan murmured, kneeling beside it. The wolf opened its golden eyes, blinking sluggishly. For a split second, Ethan saw a flicker of panic, instinct, fear, but then recognition. The wolf's ears flicked back, and it didn't bare its teeth. It remembered. It knew he wasn't a threat. Ethan set the venison down near its nose and slowly backed away, giving it space. The wolf sniffed the food cautiously, then hesitated. For a long moment, it just stared at Ethan. Then, finally, it took the food. Ethan exhaled. "Guess we're making progress," he muttered. Over the next few days, Ethan kept his distance, but remained watchful. The wolf ate whatever food he provided, though never when Ethan was too close. Its strength gradually returned, but it still couldn't put weight on its injured leg. At night, Ethan would wake up to hear soft, shifting noises as the wolf repositioned itself near the fire. And then, something strange happened. On the fourth night, when the fire started to die down, Ethan stirred awake and saw something that left him speechless. The wolf, who had kept its distance all this time, slowly pulled itself closer to the fading embers of the fire. Not just for warmth, for safety. It had chosen to trust him. Ethan swallowed hard, watching as the wolf finally let its head rest against the floor, mere feet from where he sat. The wild animal that should have feared him no longer did. Something had changed. The next morning, Ethan was out chopping firewood when something felt off. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind had stilled. The air was too quiet. He turned toward the cabin, and that's when he saw the tracks. Fresh boot prints in the snow. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. Someone had been here, and whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. Ethan's grip tightened around the axe handle. Boot prints, fresh, leading straight toward his cabin. His first instinct was to scan the tree line, his eyes sweeping over the snow-covered wilderness. Whoever had been here wasn't far. His pulse quickened. He had spent years living alone in these woods, and no one ever came this deep unless they had a reason, and that reason was rarely good. Setting the axe down, he reached for his rifle instead. Moving carefully, Ethan followed the prints. They circled near his porch, then veered off into the trees. Someone had been watching. His gut churned. Had they seen the wolf? Treading cautiously, he pushed deeper into the woods, following the tracks. The snowfall had softened, but the boot prints were deep and deliberate. Whoever had been here had stopped multiple times, watching, waiting. Then, he saw it. A steel trap, just like the one the wolf had been caught in. Only this one was new, its jagged teeth smeared with fresh bait. A fresh wave of anger surged through Ethan. Someone was setting these traps on purpose, and judging by how close it was to his cabin, they weren't just after wolves. A sharp crack echoed through the forest, a branch snapping, not far from where Ethan stood. He turned sharply, rifle raised, scanning the shadows between the trees. A figure emerged, a tall man, wrapped in a thick hunting coat, a rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was partially hidden under a fur-lined hood, but Ethan could see the smirk beneath it. "Well, well," the stranger drawled, his voice smooth but laced with something cold. "Didn't expect to see anyone else way out here." Ethan didn't lower his gun. His instincts screamed that this man was trouble. "You lost?" Ethan asked, his tone even. The man chuckled, stepping closer. "Not at all. Just tracking a wolf. Nasty thing got out of one of my traps." Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened. "Your trap?" he repeated. The man's smirk widened. He knew Ethan had taken the wolf, knew exactly where it was. Ethan's blood ran cold. For a long moment, the two men stood in tense silence. Then, the stranger's eyes flicked toward Ethan's cabin, and something in his expression darkened. "You wouldn't happen to have seen anything unusual, would you?" he asked, voice deceptively light. Ethan's mind raced. The wolf was still inside, vulnerable. He forced himself to stay calm. "No, haven't seen a thing." The man hummed, unconvinced. Then, he took another step forward. Ethan cocked his rifle, the sharp click cutting through the cold air like a blade. "That's close enough." The man's smirk finally faded. A long silence stretched between them, a test of will. Then, the stranger raised his hands, backing away slightly. "No need for trouble, friend," he said, though his tone was anything but friendly. "Just looking for what's mine." Ethan didn't blink. "Nothing here belongs to you." Another tense pause. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, the stranger took a step back. "Well then, I'll be on my way." He turned, moving back toward the trees. But before disappearing into the shadows, he cast one last glance toward the cabin. A silent message. "This isn't over." Ethan stood frozen, waiting until the stranger's footsteps faded. Only when he was sure he was alone did he turn and rush back to the cabin. The moment he stepped inside, his heart stopped. The wolf was awake, sitting up, its golden eyes fixed on Ethan like it had sensed everything that had just happened. For the first time, Ethan wasn't just worried about the wolf's survival. He was worried about his own. Ethan stood frozen inside the cabin, the door still slightly ajar, cold air swirling in. His heart pounded, his mind racing. The wolf sat near the fire, awake and alert. Its golden eyes locked onto him as if it sensed the tension in the air. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Ethan shut the door, bolted it. Ethan took off his coat, tossing it over a chair, his mind still replaying the encounter in the woods. That man, the poacher. He knew Ethan had the wolf, and he wasn't going to let it go. Ethan let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand down his face. "Well, buddy," he muttered, glancing at the wolf. "Looks like we've got a problem." The wolf didn't growl, didn't shift away. It just watched him. And in that moment, Ethan felt something strange, a silent understanding. It was as if the wolf knew that Ethan had risked everything to save it, knew that danger was coming, knew that this wasn't over. Ethan moved quickly, checking the windows, reinforcing the front and back doors. He wasn't about to be caught off guard. The poacher wasn't just some lost hunter. He had set deliberate, cruel traps in a part of the wilderness he had no right to be in. He wasn't just after a wolf. He was after control. And men like that? They didn't walk away empty-handed. Ethan loaded his rifle, setting it within reach near the table. Then he grabbed his hunting knife, slipping it into his belt. The wolf watched every movement. When Ethan finally paused, meeting the animal's gaze, something clicked. This wasn't just his fight anymore. Ethan knelt beside the wolf, keeping his movements slow, careful. "You know what's coming, don't you?" he murmured. The wolf blinked, its body tense but unafraid. For the first time, Ethan reached out, his hand hovering just above the wolf's thick fur. The animal didn't move, so Ethan took a chance. He placed his hand gently on its back. The fur was coarse, still matted in places, but warm, alive. The wolf didn't flinch. It didn't growl. It simply sat there, accepting Ethan's touch. A choice had been made. A bond had been formed. And as the fire crackled softly, casting shadows along the cabin walls, Ethan knew one thing for sure. This wolf wasn't just going to let him fight alone. The night stretched on, thick with silence. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering any trace of footprints. But Ethan knew the poacher would be back, and this time, he wouldn't come alone. Ethan sat by the window, rifle in hand. The wolf lay beside the fire, its ears twitching at every distant sound. Neither of them slept, because they weren't just man and beast anymore. They were survivors, and when morning came, they would be ready. The morning air was sharp and biting, the kind that warned of an incoming storm. But Ethan knew the real storm was already here. He stood by the window, rifle in hand, watching, waiting. The wolf lay near the door, its ears pricked, golden eyes locked on the snowy landscape outside. It had barely moved all night, every muscle tense, as if it, too, was preparing for what was coming. Then, movement. A dark figure appeared at the edge of the trees, followed by another. Ethan's jaw tightened. Not just one man this time. They had come in twos. The two men approached the cabin slowly, rifles slung over their shoulders. One of them was the poacher from before. The other was different, bulkier, meaner. Ethan counted his options. He had the advantage of higher ground and cover. But if they had come ready for a fight, this wasn't going to end with just a few words. The poacher raised a gloved hand. "Morning," he called out, his voice carrying through the cold air. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Here we go." He cracked the door open, stepping onto the porch with his rifle in full view. "You boys lost?" The bulkier man chuckled, shifting his weight. "Funny. We were just about to ask you the same thing." The poacher grinned. "We had a deal, friend. That wolf you're hiding in there, it belongs to me." Ethan's grip tightened around his rifle. A deal? So that was it. These weren't just hunters. They were traffickers. And that wolf? It wasn't just another catch. It was worth something to them. Ethan shook his head. "Ain't your wolf. Not anymore." The grin on the poacher's face disappeared. "Then I guess we got a problem." Ethan barely had time to react before the first gunshot rang out. The bullet tore through the porch railing, splintering wood inches from Ethan's leg. He dove back inside, rolling behind the table, just as another shot shattered the window. The wolf snarled, ears pinned back, its body low against the ground. It understood. They were under attack. Ethan's pulse hammered as he peeked over the table. The men were advancing, using the trees as cover. He couldn't stay inside. He had to take control of the fight. He grabbed his knife, tucking it into his belt, and looked at the wolf. "You with me?" he murmured. The wolf didn't hesitate. It stepped forward. Ethan slipped out the back door, moving low and fast through the snow. If he could flank them before they reached the cabin, He could take them by surprise. The wolf moved with him, silent as a shadow. Despite its injury, it kept pace, never falling behind. They reached the trees just as the two men passed the porch. Ethan waited, held his breath. Then, he whistled, loud, sharp. The men froze. A second later, the wolf lunged. The bulkier man barely had time to react before the wolf slammed into him from behind, knocking him off his feet. He screamed, struggling against the sheer force of the animal. The poacher spun, raising his rifle, but Ethan was faster. Crack! The shot rang out. The poacher's weapon was sent flying as he fell back into the snow. Clutching his shoulder, Ethan stepped forward, rifle aimed directly at him. "Guess we got a problem," he repeated, his voice cold. The poacher panted, eyes darting toward his injured friend, who was still pinned beneath the wolf. Ethan shook his head. "Don't bother." The wolf's teeth were bared, its low growl sending a clear message. It wasn't backing down. Ethan could see the realization settle into the poacher's face. He had lost, and this time, no trap was going to save him. By the time the sun reached its peak, the poachers were gone. Ethan had let them go, but not before making sure they left everything behind. Their weapons, their traps, their claim over the wolf. Now, standing outside the cabin, Ethan turned to the animal who had fought beside him. It sat tall and proud, the wound on its leg no longer defining it. It had survived. They both had. Ethan exhaled, kneeling beside it. So what now? The wolf stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, it stood, walked forward, and pressed its forehead lightly against Ethan's hand. A gesture of trust. A final, silent thank you. Ethan felt his chest tighten. The wild would call it back soon. He knew that. But for now, for just one more moment, they weren't just man and beast. They were something more. And that, Ethan realized, was enough. Some bonds are formed in ways we never expect. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a lesson in trust, survival, and the unbreakable connection between man and nature. If this story inspired you, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video with someone who believes in the power of second chances.